Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the July edition of Inside Immigration. Today, we're joined by partner Shoshana Green and Senior Associate Valerie Kleinman. Please feel free to ask any questions through the pop-up text bar on your screen. If we do not get your question, you can contact us through the information provided on screen right now, or you can reach out to me directly at info@gans.com. And with that being said, I'll hand things over to our panelists.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay.
So thanks for joining us today. Sure. Thank you so much for joining us today. So July has been a pretty busy month in terms of changes to different immigration policies. So we're happy to have this opportunity to share some of these changes with you. So one of the biggest changes that we saw was regarding biometrics. So as many of you are probably aware, a lot of applications have been at a standstill because applicants have been unable to complete their biometrics. And this includes applicants who are in Canada, so applicants who are extending their work permits or their study permits or their stay as a visitor or applying for a TRV in Canada. And these individuals are required normally to give their biometrics as part of the application unless they're US citizens or under 14, but they've been unable to because all of the biometric collection centers in Canada, which are at Service Canada, have been closed and are currently closed for the foreseeable future. So very recently, IRCC created a policy exemption for these individuals who are physically in Canada, who have these in Canada applications. And for the time being, they will no longer have to provide biometrics as part of those applications. There's no particular end date at this time, but what it does mean is that these applications can now be finalized, because before, although you could submit a complete application, it couldn't move to a period of, where the officer could finalize it without the biometrics. Now they can be finalized. This may mean that we'll see some increases to processing times, because now we'll have a number of applications that have been sitting for a couple of months that will be able to be processed. So we'll have to see in the coming month or so what happens with these applications. But this is definitely very good news for people who've been waiting or people who are about to file those applications who don't have to worry about the biometric requirement. At the same time, the biometric requirements for people applying for temporary documents abroad remain in place. So if you are applying for a work permit outside of Canada, you do still have to provide biometrics. And the good news is there are more and more biometric collection centers that are reopening around the world. So for example, the Visa Application Center in New York City has reopened. Some of the VACs in Europe have reopened, but there are, of course, some large, important VACs that remain closed, for example, in India and Mexico. So for those individuals, their applications will continue to remain on hold until the biometrics stage of the application to be completed. There are very limited exceptions to request a biometric exemption, so most people will see these applications on hold. And for individuals applying for permanent residence, there is still a biometric requirement, but they are allowing for more time to complete the biometrics. So instead of normally it's 30 days, now it's 90 days, and IRCC is not going to penalize people who can't get it done because there's nowhere to do it where they're residing.
Yeah, so it's good news, bad news. People inside Canada have the good news. Outside, we're just gonna have to wait and be a little bit more patient. It's a similar scenario, good news, bad news, when it comes to express entry applications. The good news is the points have been lowering steadily for those applicants who are in Canada who have Canadian experience. So there's been focus draws for Canadian experience class applicants. Most recently, the score was 445, and I believe that's one of the lowest ones we've seen in a very long time. And that's very good news for those individuals who have been able to conclude their English tests and have their education degrees evaluated and are in a position to put up their profiles through the express entry system. So that's the good news. The bad news is the score for federal skilled workers. We had the first one on July the 8th. That's remaining quite high at 478. So for those who don't have Canadian experience, who are likely abroad, the minimum threshold is still very, very high for those who are abroad. But the hope is that somewhere we're going to land in the middle when we sort of get back to normal. And there are steps now for getting back to normal. I just, I had someone who took an English test last week, and he only signed up a couple days before, which I thought was pretty lucky, because I would expect there'll be a big backlog now that the English testing is reopening. There were only 8 people in the room to take the English test, but he was able to do it. And that's a very good sign for those individuals who are on the path to being able to put forward express entry applications here in Canada for the Canadian Experience class. Do we know what the scores are going to be in the future? We don't. But right now it's a downward trend for Canadian Experience class. Federal skilled worker is exactly where it was sort of pre-March. And it's sustaining itself with being a high standard that the government is setting for those individuals. But again, it's all a wait and see to see, you know, what the department decides to do. We'll probably have another draw in a week or two, and we don't know if it'll be focused on Canadian Experience class, or perhaps they'll open it up again to federal skilled workers. The government always likes to do fun things around long weekends, so you never know what's going to happen after this weekend. Well, it's a long weekend in lots of provinces here in Canada. So, and then on the express entry front, they are processing the applications. The timeline, obviously the numbers, they're trying to sustain the numbers through focused CEC draws or PNP draws. So they've been maintaining the numbers. Obviously the staffing is shorter, so perhaps the processing times for those newer applicants may be extended, but again, we don't know. Perhaps they'll triage them and focus on them, given that other sort of streams of work are in short supply. So we're hoping for more good news than bad news, and we'll keep focusing on that. As far as the express entry, we'll see maybe the CEC candidates will continue to benefit and the scores will go down, but we will wait and see. Now I'm going to hand it over to Val to talk about compliance inspections on quarantine issues.
Thanks, Shoshana. So for the last couple of months, we've had a whole new process in place to deal with individuals who are entering Canada on work permits, whose employers are subject to new compliance requirements. So generally speaking, when you have a worker on a closed work permit, a work permit that's tied to a company, the company can be subject to compliance inspections and has compliance obligations. Generally speaking, you know, they're looking at things like, is the wage, are the duties, is the location of employment all consistent with what was put in the application? Now, the legislation allows for inspections on additional issues, and that's looking at if the foreign worker is required to quarantine when they enter, what's the employer doing during that quarantine period? So individuals entering Canada are required to quarantine for 14 days upon entry. And when you have a foreign worker entering, there are obligations on the side of the employer to make sure that the employer is not doing anything to prevent that foreign worker from complying with their quarantine obligations. So we have seen in the last couple of months, definitely Immigration and Service Canada are conducting inspections specifically on these quarantine issues. So they really want to see whether the employer is doing anything to prevent that foreign worker from quarantining. So as an example, you know, if the person is going to be working remotely during that 2-week quarantine period, is the employer asking them to go pick up a laptop somewhere to be able to do that work, which which you can't do, because then the foreign worker would be being asked to basically breach their quarantine. So they want to make sure that the employer is not doing anything to prevent that foreign worker from meeting their requirements under the Quarantine Act. And they also want to make sure that employers are paying foreign workers substantially the same wage as what they're going to be paid throughout the course of their work permit during that 14-day period, regardless of whether they're able to perform their duties remotely or not while in quarantine. So this is just something to be very aware of and to plan before you have a foreign worker coming in, to really determine the logistics of how they're going to be working remotely, if they will, and what you're going to be putting in place as an employer to make sure that they're set up for success and they don't do anything to breach their quarantine requirements, and ensure that everything is set up in terms of their compensation and all of that. And we are definitely seeing a lot of these inspections happening, and they're pretty brief. There's a short turnaround to provide the officers with information. They generally want to see the information within 48 hours. So it's intended to be a very quick process, but it's very important that employers be prepared for these new added requirements. And of course, we're happy to help with these inspections and provide advice on these matters.
Tricky times for employers, for sure.
Definitely.
So the last topic we just wanted to touch upon was students, which being an international student in Canada right now, if you were already here, you had your study permits before March 18th, 2020, you're okay. But for those who are beginning their studies, who are entering the first year of their programs, it can be very challenging and frustrating, because for the majority of those individuals, they won't be able to come to Canada to begin their studies. For American citizens, they're the only ones who have sort of the best case scenario here, as they can present their study permits at the border, and as long as the program of study requires their presence here in Canada, meaning that either the schools are going to be in person or a hybrid type of class, then they can enter. But for the majority of those around the world coming to Canada to start their programs of study, who have study permit applications, who've been approved past March 18th or in the process of it, and they can't complete it because of the biometrics problem or other issues, police clearances, they will be starting those programs from abroad. But immigration did most recently, to sort of allow for those students not to lose the opportunities for postgraduate work permits later on, they've announced this program now where it's almost like a two-step study permit. You can apply for your study permit, and you can get, we'll call it a provisional approval, pending completing other steps. And that provisional approval, called first stage approval, will allow you to start your studies abroad online, and that won't penalize you as long as 50% of those studies are complete, at least 50% is completed in Canada. You'll be protected from the benefits, and one of the biggest benefits of being an international student in Canada, the benefit of the postgraduate work permit upon graduating. Obviously, we don't know what the world will be in 6 months, 1 year, 2 years from now, but the government has set this in place right now to somehow ease the trouble that these students are facing right now. So it's a bit precarious. It's a bit, some students may decide, you may defer it, or you may be okay with this. It's really a personal situation here, and government's trying to balance that in this new program that they announced a short time ago. So that's it for international students, and then we're going to open it up to a few questions. I think first question, somebody asked about the parent-grandparent sponsorship for 2020. Government has announced that it will happen, but we just, again, don't know when. We can't predict when they're going to open it. But the only thing, and we don't know the actual process, because even before COVID, they had announced they're going to reevaluate how they release the details of this program, because every year there are a number of issues and challenges for potential applicants. So they're trying to make it better. Hopefully they will. When that happens, we don't know. What it will look like, we don't know. The only thing I'm pretty confident is that potential sponsors will still need to meet the income requirements, which are 30% higher than for any other type of sponsorship. And that, you know, that's sort of the main issue that will remain, in my opinion, with respect to the parent sponsorships. And I think that's covered everything. Stephen, are there any other issues? I don't think we have any other questions.
Let me see here if there's a few more questions just popping up. One here says students under the postgraduate work permit are having trouble getting jobs right now. Do you know any kind of extension?
No, they've clearly said it's status quo with respect to the students, unfortunately. That's going to remain as it is right now.
Mm-hmm.
No changes for that.
Okay. I see
There's
another one here.
Question.
Sorry, Val, go ahead.
Oh, there's a question about entry for emergency repairs and quarantine. So the general rule is that everybody does need to quarantine when they enter the country, and that includes even Canadian citizens who are outside and returning. There are very limited exceptions. There are, in some cases, possibilities to request an exemption from the quarantine requirements. Very, very limited. There can be certain situations and critical repair situations involving infrastructure where that may be possible. It's something we would really need to look at very closely to see if those requirements would be met, and then a request has to be made to get that exemption. So the assumption really for everyone should be that if they are able to enter Canada because they generally qualify under an exemption to enter, that they will have to quarantine, and they would need special permission if they're going to not quarantine, and that special permission is given in very select and very few cases.
Do we have any others?
I
think that's it. Stephen, I think, is that it?
Yeah, I believe that's it. I'm just having a quick look here. We pretty much answered everything. So that is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank everyone in attendance for participating in the webinar, and I'd also like to thank Shoshana and Valerie for sharing their expert insight during today's webinar. I'd like to encourage everybody to follow us on social media to stay up to date on the latest topics inside immigration. And if there's any questions, you can reach out to Shoshana, Val. And until next time, everybody, stay safe.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.